The gavel hung motionless in Judge Morrison's weathered hand, suspended like a sword of judgment over Martha Crowfeather's trembling figure as she clutched the custody papers that would determine whether 5 Native American children would vanish forever into the government's civilization machine. The courtroom held its breath, every soul present knowing that one word from this man would either unite a family forged in love or shatter it beyond repair. This wasn't supposed to be about survival. It was supposed to be about a simple job cooking meals. The prosecutor's chair crashed backward as Dr. Augustus Whitman shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage at the unexpected turn of testimony. Mothers in the gallery gasped, covering their children's eyes as if witnessing an execution. The smell of fear and sweat filled the packed room like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha's eyes found little Swift Arrow pressed against the back window, his small palm flat against the glass like a caged bird, and she remembered the first morning he'd called her Mama over pancakes that seemed a lifetime ago. "Decide now, Your Honor," the federal marshal barked, his hand resting on iron shackles. "The train to Carlisle leaves at dawn." Would love be enough to defeat a system designed to destroy families? And how many more children would be lost before someone found the courage to say enough? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Martha Crowfeather had stepped off the dusty stagecoach at Red Mesa Ranch with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the hollow ache of a woman who had buried too many dreams. At 52, her Cherokee Scottish features bore the weathered dignity of someone who had survived government schools, a loveless marriage, and the unspeakable grief of losing 3 babies to the same system that now threatened this family. Her calloused hands told stories of hard work and harder losses, but her dark eyes still held the fierce ember of a woman who refused to surrender completely. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly around the modest ranch, red canyon walls rising like ancient guardians against a sky so vast it seemed to swallow hope itself. Sagebrush and prickly pear dotted the harsh landscape, while the distant mountains shimmered in the desert heat like mirages of promises that might never come true. This was reservation border country, where 2 worlds collided daily and the strongest survived by learning to walk in both. Joseph Standing Bear emerged from the barn, a man carved by loss and hardened by necessity. His Lakota Irish heritage showed in his high cheekbones and green eyes, but grief had etched lines around those eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible choices. At 45, he carried himself with the careful pride of a man who had learned that showing weakness could cost everything. His wife Rebecca had died giving birth to their youngest child, leaving him to raise 5 children alone in a world that viewed single fathers with suspicion and mixed-blood families with outright hostility. The children appeared one by one like cautious deer emerging from cover. Little Wolf, 16, and angry at a world that had taken his mother, stood with fists clenched and jaw set in permanent defiance. Morning Star, 14, possessed her mother's artistic soul but carried the weight of premature responsibility in her careful movements. Dancing Rain, 10, watched Martha with the calculating gaze of a child who had learned early that adults often disappeared without warning. 7-year-old Swift Arrow hung back behind his father's legs, thumb in his mouth, while 3-year-old baby Singing Bird toddled around, oblivious to the tension that crackled between the adults. Martha had come seeking honest work and perhaps a measure of peace in her twilight years. The advertisement in the territorial newspaper had been simple. Widower with 5 children seeks housekeeper, room, board, modest wages. References required. She had no way of knowing that this desperate father's plea would become her last chance at the motherhood that had been stolen from her decades ago, or that loving these children would require her to fight the same government that had once torn her own babies from her arms. The year was 1887 when the Indian Wars were winding down, but the Cultural War was intensifying. Federal policy demanded assimilation at any cost, and mixed families like the Standing Bears lived in constant fear of officials who could declare children abandoned or improperly cared for with the stroke of a pen. In this harsh landscape where survival depended on adaptation, Martha would soon discover that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the fierce, protective love of a mother's heart. Martha's first week at Red Mesa Ranch felt like trying to tame a pack of wounded wolves. The children circled her with the wariness of creatures who had learned that kindness often came with a price, and trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Little Wolf made his hostility clear from the moment she unpacked her bag, his green eyes blazing with the fury of a young man forced to grow up too fast. "We don't need another white woman telling us who to be," he spat, as Martha attempted to serve breakfast on her second morning. The eggs she had carefully prepared sat untouched as he grabbed a piece of stale bread and stalked out, his younger siblings watching the confrontation with wide, frightened eyes. Morning Star quickly gathered baby Singing Bird into her arms, as if shielding the toddler from another potential abandonment, while Dancing Rain crossed her arms in unconscious mimicry of her eldest brother's defiance. Only Swift Arrow seemed immune to the family's collective suspicion. The 7-year-old appeared at Martha's elbow constantly, his thumb perpetually in his mouth as he watched her every movement with the desperate attention of a child seeking an anchor in stormy seas. When she knelt to tie his shoelaces or smoothed his unruly black hair, he would lean into her touch like a flower turning toward the sun, and something deep in Martha's chest would crack open just a little more. Joseph maintained a careful distance, speaking only when necessary, and watching her with the guarded expression of a man who had learned that hope was often the cruelest emotion of all. He worked from dawn to dusk, tending cattle and mending fences, returning each evening exhausted and covered in dust. At dinner, he would nod his thanks for the meal she had prepared, but his eyes never quite met hers, as if afraid that acknowledging her humanity might make her inevitable departure more painful. The children's physical condition told the story of a family barely surviving. Their clothes bore careful patches and their shoes were worn thin, but it was the emotional neglect that cut Martha deepest. Baby Singing Bird had regressed to crawling, though she was old enough to walk confidently. Morning Star's beautiful sketches lay abandoned in a corner, her artistic spirit dimmed by the weight of premature responsibility. Dancing Rain tested every boundary Martha set, as if daring another adult to prove they would stay when challenged. Martha discovered that the children had been subsisting on a diet of hardtack, beans, and whatever game Little Wolf could hunt. They had been taking turns sleeping in Joseph's room during thunderstorms, piling together like puppies seeking warmth and comfort. Their father was too overwhelmed to provide. None of them had attended school regularly since their mother's death, and Baby Singing Bird showed signs of developmental delays that proper nutrition and attention could still address. The breaking point came during Martha's second week, when a spring thunderstorm rolled across the desert with the fury of an Old Testament plague. Lightning split the sky like God's own fire, and thunder shook the small ranch house to its foundations. Martha woke to find Swift Arrow pressed against her bedroom door, his small body trembling with terror as rain lashed against the windows. "The thunder is angry," he whispered when she opened the door, his thumb wet with tears and saliva. "It sounds like the night Mama went away." Without hesitation, Martha scooped him into her arms and carried him to the kitchen, where she began brewing chamomile tea by lamplight. One by one, the other children appeared like ghosts, drawn by the gentle sounds of comfort. Dancing Rain came first, then Morning Star carrying Baby Singing Bird, and finally even Little Wolf, his pride warring with his need for the maternal comfort he pretended to despise. Martha didn't ask questions or make demands. She simply made space for each child, settling them around the kitchen table with warm tea and slices of the cornbread she had baked earlier. She began to hum an old Cherokee lullaby her grandmother had taught her, the ancient melody weaving through the storm's fury like a thread of gold through dark cloth. My grandmother used to say that thunder was just the Great Spirit rearranging the furniture in the sky house. She told them softly, watching as baby singing bird's eyelids grew heavy. All that noise means something beautiful is being set right. Little Wolf looked up sharply at the Cherokee words woven through her explanation, his hostility replaced by confusion. "You're not just white," he said, more statement than question. Martha met his gaze steadily, seeing in his face the same wounded pride she had carried at his age. "No, child, I'm not. And neither are you just anything. You're everything your mama and daddy made you. And that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." For the first time since her arrival, the house fell silent except for the gradually diminishing storm outside, and Martha felt the first tentative threads of trust beginning to weave themselves around her heart. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with Martha grinding corn for breakfast while the desert sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. 3 weeks had passed since the thunderstorm that had broken down the children's initial defenses, and the house had begun to breathe with something resembling peace. Swift Arrow no longer flinched when she reached to smooth his hair, and even Little Wolf had stopped glaring at her with quite so much venom. But peace, Martha had learned long ago, was often just the calm before a more terrible storm. The sound of approaching horses sent Dancing Rain scrambling to the window, her face pressed against the glass as she counted the riders. "Papa!" she called toward the barn where Joseph was shoeing horses. 3 men coming up the canyon road. They're wearing suits. Martha's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Men in suits never brought good news to families like theirs. She had seen enough government officials in her lifetime to recognize the particular way they sat their horses, straight-backed with the rigid posture of men who believed themselves the bearers of civilization to the unwashed masses. Her hands trembled as she set down the corn grinder, and suddenly she was 17 again, watching similar men ride up to her family's cabin in the Oklahoma hills. Joseph emerged from the barn, his movements careful and controlled, but Martha could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like a spring wound too tight. He called for the children to come inside, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Little Wolf herded his siblings toward the house with the protective instincts of a young wolf guarding his pack, while Martha stood frozen in the doorway, her Cherokee grandmother's warnings echoing across the decades. When the government comes calling, children disappear. The lead rider was a tall, thin man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter frost. He dismounted with practiced efficiency and approached the porch with the measured stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His companions, younger men with the soft look of city dwellers, stayed mounted and watchful, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Mr. Standing Bear," the man called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of education and privilege. "I am Dr. Augustus Whitman, representing the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Education Initiative. I trust you received our correspondence regarding the educational opportunities available for your children." Joseph's jaw tightened, and Martha saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "I received your letters, Dr. Whitman. I believe I made my position clear in my responses." Dr. Whitman's smile held all the warmth of a snake's embrace. "Mr. Standing Bear, surely you understand that your personal preferences cannot supersede what is best for these children's futures. The Carlisle Industrial School represents the finest opportunity for Native children to learn proper skills and integrate into civilized society. It would be selfish to deny them such advantages. Behind Martha, she could hear the children's frightened whispers and baby singing birds' soft whimpering as Morning Star tried to comfort her. Swift Arrow pressed himself against Martha's leg, his small hand gripping her skirt with white-knuckled desperation. The weight of their trust and terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Dr. Whitman," Martha stepped forward, her voice steady despite the earthquake of fear shaking her bones. "I am Martha Crow Feather, the children's caretaker. Perhaps you could explain exactly what opportunities you're offering that they cannot receive here in their own home, with their own family." Whitman's cold eyes assessed her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to cataloging human worth by appearance and bloodline. "Ah, the housekeeper. I'm afraid this matter concerns the children's legal guardian, not the hired help. Though I must say, Mr. Standing Bear, employing a woman of questionable heritage to influence your children's development raises additional concerns about their proper moral guidance." The insult hit its mark, but Martha had endured worse from better men than this government vulture. What chilled her to the bone was the way Whitman's gaze lingered on each child, as if already counting his commission. She had heard whispers in the Cherokee settlements about officials who received bounties for each child delivered to the government schools, $50 per head, enough to make child stealing a profitable enterprise for men who could convince themselves they were saving souls. The Carlisle School offers discipline, proper education in useful trades, and most importantly, removal from the primitive influences that keep these children trapped in an inferior way of life, Whitman continued, his voice taking on the fervor of a man convinced of his own righteousness. "At Carlisle, they will learn to read and write proper English, practice Christian virtues, and acquire skills that will allow them to contribute meaningfully to American society." Joseph's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the controlled fury of a man pushed beyond his breaking point. "They can read and write now, Dr. Whitman. They practice the virtues their mother taught them, and they already contribute to our family and community. What you're offering isn't education, it's obliteration." Whitman's facade of civility cracked slightly, revealing the steel beneath. "Mr. Standing Bear, I had hoped to conduct this conversation as gentlemen, but your intransigence forces me to be more direct. The territorial government has concerns about your ability to properly care for 5 children as a single father, particularly given your financial circumstances and your choice to employ this woman as their primary influence." He gestured dismissively toward Martha, his contempt evident. "We have reports of irregular schooling, inadequate nutrition, and exposure to heathen practices that retard the children's moral development. The Bureau is prepared to offer you a choice: voluntary enrollment of your children in the Carlisle program, where they will receive proper care and education, or formal proceedings to determine their welfare under territorial law." The threat hung in the desert air like a gathering storm, and Martha felt the familiar weight of history repeating itself. 30 years ago, she had been powerless to stop similar men from destroying her world. But she was no longer 17 and terrified. She was a woman who had survived government schools, loveless marriage, and crushing loss, and she would be damned if she would let them take these children without the fight of their lives. The 30 days Dr. Whitman had granted them passed like sand through an hourglass, each grain marking time toward a decision that would either preserve their family or destroy it forever. Martha threw herself into research with the desperate intensity of a woman who understood that knowledge was their only weapon against an enemy armed with law and prejudice. She wrote letters to every contact she could remember from her youth, reaching out to Cherokee families who had survived the government school system and lived to tell their stories. The responses that trickled back painted a picture so horrifying that Martha sometimes wished she had remained ignorant. Children died of disease and despair in the government schools, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, while officials reported them as successfully transitioned to white society. Those who survived returned home as strangers, unable to speak their native languages or connect with the families they had been torn from. Some never returned at all, disappearing into the vast machinery of American assimilation like stones dropped into a deep well. "Listen to this," Martha told Joseph one evening as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. Her voice shook as she read from a letter written by a Cheyenne mother whose son had been taken to Carlisle 5 years earlier. They cut off his braids the first day and told him his name was now John Smith. When he cried for his mother, they locked him in a cellar for 3 days with no food. He learned not to cry after that. He learned not to remember who he was. Joseph's hands gripped the porch railing until his knuckles went white. "How many children, Martha? How many families have they destroyed with this madness?" "Thousands," she whispered, folding the letter with trembling fingers. "And they call it progress." But even as they gathered evidence of the school's horrors, Martha began to notice changes in Dr. Whitman's approach that gave her a sliver of hope. Instead of the harsh ultimatum she had expected, he began making regular visits to the ranch, bringing small gifts for the children and speaking in increasingly gentle tones about the opportunities that awaited them. He praised Dancing Rain's quick mind and Morning Star's artistic talents, suggesting that Carlisle could nurture these gifts in ways that our isolated ranch never could. "Perhaps I judged your situation too harshly," he admitted to Martha during one of these visits, his manner almost apologetic. "I can see that you have genuine affection for these children, and they seem more settled than when I first arrived. The Bureau values family stability above all else." Martha wanted desperately to believe in this softer version of the man, but her grandmother's voice whispered warnings in her ear. "Honey draws more flies than vinegar," the old woman used to say. "But the honey is still meant to trap you." As if sensing her growing hope, Joseph chose that moment to make a proposal that took Martha's breath away. They were standing by the corral watching Swift Arrow attempt to feed carrots to an old mare when he turned to her with an expression she had never seen before, vulnerable and fierce at the same time. "Marry me," he said simply, the words falling into the desert air like stones into still water. "Not because of Whitman or the government or any of the madness surrounding us. Marry me because these children need a mother, and I need a partner who understands what we're fighting for." Martha stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "Joseph, I loved Rebecca with the passion of youth," he continued, his green eyes never leaving her face. "But I love you with the wisdom of a man who knows loss, who understands that love isn't just about feeling, it's about choosing to stand together when the whole world tries to tear you apart." The proposal should have filled her with joy, but instead it brought a crushing wave of terror. Love had always been dangerous for her, a luxury that invited loss and heartbreak. She had learned to survive by keeping her heart carefully guarded, by never investing too much hope in anything that could be taken away. But these children had already slipped past her defenses, and now Joseph was asking her to risk everything on the promise of a happiness she wasn't sure she deserved. "The children deserve better than a broken-down old woman with more scars than sense," she whispered. But even as she spoke the words, Swift Arrow appeared at her elbow, slipping his small hand into hers with the trust that always undid her. "Mama Martha," he said solemnly, using the name that had emerged naturally over the weeks of her care. "Are you going to be our real mama now? Forever and always?" Looking down into his earnest face, Martha felt the last of her resistance crumble. "Yes, sweetheart, forever and always." The wedding was planned for late August, a simple ceremony that would unite two wounded souls and formalize the family bonds that had already formed in their hearts. The local Cherokee and Lakota communities rallied around them, offering traditional gifts and blessings that honored both cultures. Even some of their white neighbors expressed cautious support, perhaps sensing that this union represented something larger than just two people finding love. It was a statement that families could be chosen, that heritage was strength rather than shame, and that love was more powerful than law. Dr. Whitman attended their planning meetings with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, offering to serve as an official witness to their successful integration into American family values. His presence should have been reassuring, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap as carefully constructed as any spider's web. The night before the wedding, as Martha helped Morning Star arrange wild flowers for the ceremony, the girl looked up with eyes too wise for her 14 years. "Do you think we'll really get to stay together?" she asked quietly. "Do you think the government men will let us be a family?" Martha paused in her flower arranging, choosing her words carefully. "I think love is the strongest force in the universe, stronger than any law or government. And I think your mama is watching over us, making sure her babies are protected." "I dream about her sometimes," Morning Star confessed. "She tells me to trust you, that you were sent to keep us safe. Do you think that's real, or just wishful thinking?" Martha pulled the girl into her arms, breathing in the scent of sage and desert flowers that clung to her hair. "I think the line between dreams and truth is thinner than most people believe, and I think your mama loved you enough to send you exactly what you needed, even if it came in a form you didn't expect." The wedding morning dawned clear and bright, the desert air crisp with the promise of autumn. Martha dressed in a simple blue dress that had been her mother's, while the children gathered wildflowers and Joseph nervously adjusted his one good suit. The ceremony was to be held under the ancient cottonwood tree beside the creek, with Father Miguel presiding and the entire community bearing witness to their vows. But as the guests began to arrive and the children fidgeted with excitement, Martha noticed something that made her blood run cold. Dr. Whitman had brought additional witnesses, federal marshals who stood apart from the celebration with the grim efficiency of men prepared for trouble. When she caught Joseph's eye, she saw her own fear reflected in his face. They had walked directly into the trap, drawn by the false promise of acceptance and legitimacy. The wedding they had planned as a celebration of love and family unity was about to become the stage for their destruction. Dr. Whitman's sudden supportiveness hadn't been a change of heart. It had been bait, designed to lure them into a false sense of security before he sprang his true plan. As Father Miguel called for the ceremony to begin and the children gathered around them with bright, expectant faces, Martha realized with crystalline clarity that they had mere minutes before their world exploded. The government hadn't come to witness their wedding, they had come to arrest them for it. The moment Father Miguel asked if anyone objected to the union, Dr. Whitman stepped forward with the theatrical timing of a man who had orchestrated this scene down to the smallest detail. His voice cut through the desert air like a blade, shattering the fragile happiness that had bloomed around the wedding party. "I'm afraid I must object, Your Honor," Whitman announced, pulling official documents from his coat with a flourish. "Under the authority vested in me by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the territorial government, I hereby declare this union invalid and these children to be in immediate moral and physical danger." The federal marshals moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the wedding party before anyone could react. Martha felt Joseph's hand grip hers with desperate strength as the trap snapped shut around them, exactly as she had feared. The children pressed closer together, their faces pale with confusion and terror as the adults they trusted most were suddenly branded as criminals. "Mrs. Crow-Feather," Whitman continued, his voice dripping with false regret, "you are hereby charged with corrupting the moral development of minor children through the practice of heathen rituals and the promotion of savage customs contrary to Christian civilization. Mr. Standing Bear, you are charged with child endangerment through negligent supervision and the deliberate exposure of minors to degrading influences." Little Wolf stepped forward, his 16-year-old frame rigid with fury that made him seem far older than his years. "You can't take them!" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "They haven't done anything wrong. They love us." "Son," one of the marshals said, not unkindly, "your guardians have been filling your head with lies about what's natural and proper. The Carlisle School will help you understand the difference between true affection and the primitive attachments that keep your people trapped in ignorance." "Primitive?" Morningstar's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried the sharp edge of her mother's Cherokee pride. "You call love primitive? You call caring for your family savage? What does that make you, Dr. Whitman, when you tear children from the only parents they've ever known?" Whitman's mask of benevolence finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "It makes me a patriot, child, a man willing to make hard decisions for the greater good of this nation. Your attachment to these people is exactly the kind of backward thinking that the school system is designed to eliminate." As the marshals moved to separate the family, Martha's mind raced through every legal precedent she could remember from her youth. "Dr. Whitman," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to navigate the white man's legal system through bitter experience. "Under what specific statute are you claiming authority over these children? Mr. Standing Bear is their legal father, and I am about to become their legal guardian through marriage. You have no grounds for intervention." Whitman's smile was sharp as winter frost. "On the contrary, Mrs. Crowfeather, your marriage ceremony itself provides the grounds. The territorial government has determined that mixed marriages between persons of questionable moral character pose an inherent threat to child welfare. Furthermore, your influence over these children constitutes a form of cultural contamination that impedes their assimilation into civilized society." The legal trap was masterfully constructed. By encouraging the wedding, Whitman had maneuvered them into providing him with the very evidence he needed to justify his actions. The marriage that was meant to protect the family had instead become the weapon used to destroy it. Father Miguel stepped forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Dr. Whitman, I have presided over this community for 15 years, and I have never seen children more loved or better cared for than these. Your accusations are not only unfounded, they are an abomination before God." "Father Miguel," Whitman replied coolly, "your spiritual guidance is appreciated, but the law is clear. These children require proper American education and moral instruction, not the confused mixture of paganism and sentiment that passes for child-rearing in this household." As the marshals began to physically separate the family, Swift Arrow broke free from Morningstar's protective embrace and threw himself at Martha's legs, his small arms wrapping around her with desperate strength. "Mama, Martha!" he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Don't let them take me. I'll be good." "I promise I'll be good." The sound of his panic shattered something deep in Martha's chest. This was her worst nightmare made manifest, watching helplessly as the government tore another set of children from her arms, just as they had 30 years ago. But this time, she was not a powerless 17-year-old girl. This time, she would fight with everything she had. "You will not take these children," Martha declared, stepping between Swift Arrow and the advancing marshal. "I don't care what papers you wave or what laws you claim. These are not your children to take." The marshal's hand moved to his weapon, and the entire scene balanced on the edge of violence. "Ma'am, please step aside. We don't want anyone to get hurt, but we have our orders." "Your orders," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man pushed beyond all endurance, "are to destroy a loving family in the name of progress." If that's what your law requires, then your law is evil." Baby Singing Bird began to wail, the sound piercing and heartbroken as she sensed the terror radiating from every adult around her. Dancing Rain tried to comfort her youngest sister while keeping a protective arm around Swift Arrow, her 10-year-old face set in lines of determination that should never have been necessary. The community members who had come to celebrate a wedding found themselves witnessing an atrocity. Some of the white neighbors shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that their silence made them complicit in what was unfolding. Others began to murmur protests, their voices growing stronger as they realized they were watching something fundamentally wrong. "Dr. Whitman," called out Samuel Morrison, the retired territorial judge who had come to witness the ceremony, "I've reviewed territorial law extensively, and I see no provision that allows for the seizure of children from fit parents based solely on cultural practices. Perhaps we should adjourn to my office and review the legal basis for your actions." Whitman's eyes flashed with irritation at this unexpected challenge to his authority. "Judge Morrison, with all due respect, you are retired and no longer have jurisdiction in these matters. The federal government's authority in Indian affairs supersedes territorial law." "The federal government's authority," Morrison replied carefully, "extends to treaty obligations and reservation governance. These children live on private land with their natural father. I believe the burden of proof lies with you to demonstrate actual harm or neglect." For the first time since his arrival, Whitman looked uncertain. The legal challenge from a respected former judge had caught him off guard, and Martha could see him calculating whether to press forward with force or retreat to regroup. The moment hung suspended like a drop of water on the edge of a leaf, trembling between disaster and salvation. Then Little Wolf made a decision that changed everything. With the fluid grace of his Lakota heritage, he stepped directly in front of Dr. Whitman, his young face blazing with the kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. "If you want to take us," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd, "you'll have to explain to all these people why 5 children who have never been happier or healthier in their lives need to be torn from the only real family they've ever known. You'll have to explain why love is dangerous and why caring is primitive and why the government knows better than a child's own heart who should raise them." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, and Martha felt a fierce pride bloom in her chest alongside the terror. This boy, this magnificent, brave boy, had found his voice at the moment when it mattered most. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as a family. The shackles felt heavier than iron chains as Martha sat in the cramped jail cell, listening to the sound of children crying somewhere in the darkness beyond the stone walls. They had taken Joseph to a separate facility, standard procedure to prevent conspiracy between co-defendants, the marshal had explained with the casual efficiency of a man who destroyed families for a living. Through the small, barred window, Martha could see the building where they were holding the children temporarily, waiting for the morning train that would carry them to Carlisle and oblivion. The sound of Swift Arrow's voice calling, "Mama Martha! Mama Martha!" had echoed through the town as they dragged him away, his small hands reaching for her until the distance swallowed his cries. That sound would haunt her dreams for whatever remained of her broken life. She had failed again. Failed as completely and devastatingly as she had 30 years ago when her own babies were torn from her arms. The pattern was repeating itself with the relentless precision of a nightmare, and she was powerless to stop it. Dr. Whitman's victory had been swift and total. Within hours of the arrests, he had produced testimony from concerned citizens who swore they had witnessed heathen rituals and dangerous cultural practices at the Standing Bear Ranch. The fact that these same citizens had attended the wedding celebration seemed irrelevant to the territorial magistrate, a nervous man who clearly wanted no part of challenging federal authority. The children would be on tomorrow's train, and Martha and Joseph would face trial for child endangerment and corruption of minors. Mrs. Crow-Feather? The voice came from the shadows beyond her cell, gentle and familiar. Father Miguel stepped into the lamplight, his weathered face etched with lines of sorrow and determination. "I've come to hear your confession, if you're willing." Martha looked up from where she sat on the narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap like a woman awaiting execution. "What sin should I confess, Father? Loving children who needed love? Trying to keep a family together? Teaching them to be proud of who they are? Those aren't sins, my child. Those are the highest virtues of the human heart." Father Miguel pulled a wooden stool close to the bars, settling himself with the careful movements of an old man who had seen too much suffering. "I've come to tell you that you're not alone in this fight. Judge Morrison has been working through the night, filing appeals and challenging Whitman's authority. Half the town is in an uproar over what happened today." A bitter laugh escaped Martha's throat. "Too little too late, Father. The children will be gone by morning, and all the outrage in the world won't bring them back. I should have seen this coming. I should have protected them better." "You loved them," Father Miguel said simply. "Sometimes love requires us to take risks that more cautious people wouldn't understand. You gave those children something they desperately needed, a mother's heart when theirs had been broken by loss." Through the walls, Martha could hear the sound of baby singing birds' cries, the heartbroken wailing of a 3-year-old who couldn't understand why the world had suddenly become cold and frightening again. The sound was like a knife twisting in her chest, each sob a reminder of her failure to keep them safe. "I had 3 babies once," Martha whispered, the words torn from some deep place she rarely allowed herself to visit. "Government men came and said Cherokee women couldn't raise proper children, that we were too primitive to understand what civilization meant. They took my babies when the youngest was barely walking, said it was for their own good." Father Miguel leaned closer to the bars, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "What happened to them?" "I don't know." The admission came out as barely a whisper. "They disappeared into the system like stones, dropped into deep water. For 30 years I've wondered if they lived, if they remembered me, if they died calling for a mother who couldn't save them. And now it's happening again, and I'm just as powerless as I was then." "But you're not the same woman who lost those babies," Father Miguel said gently. "You're stronger now, wiser. You've survived things that would have broken lesser souls. And this time, you're not alone." As if summoned by his words, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside Martha's cell. Judge Morrison appeared, flanked by 2 men Martha didn't recognize, one tall and distinguished with the bearing of a politician, the other shorter and more scholarly, carrying an armload of legal documents. "Mrs. Crow-Feather," Judge Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled excitement, "I'd like you to meet Congressman William Hayes and Attorney Samuel Blackhorse. They've traveled from Washington to investigate irregularities in the territorial administration of federal Indian policy." The shorter man, Attorney Blackhorse, stepped forward with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating between 2 worlds. His features marked him as Native American, but his expensive suit and educated bearing spoke of success in the white man's legal system. "Mrs. Crow-Feather, we've been tracking Dr. Whitman's activities for several months. Your case may be the key to exposing a pattern of corruption that reaches far beyond this territory." Martha stared at them, afraid to hope after so much devastation. "What kind of corruption?" "Financial, primarily," Congressman Hayes answered, his politician's voice carefully neutral. "Dr. Whitman has been receiving $50 for each child he delivers to the Carlisle school, but the federal appropriations for those same children continue for months or even years after many of them have died. Someone has been collecting money for the care and education of dead children. We believe Whitman and several associates have been systematically targeting mixed families and families with resources worth seizing," Attorney Blackhorse continued. "The children are secondary. The real goal is the land, the livestock, and the bounty payments. Your family was selected not because the children needed saving, but because your ranch and your assets made you profitable targets. The revelation hit Martha like a physical blow. The systematic destruction of her family hadn't been about ideology or misguided attempts at civilization. It had been about money. Swift Arrow's tears, Morning Star's artistic spirit, Little Wolf's fierce pride, all of it had been reduced to line items in a government ledger, profit margins in a business that traded in human misery. "Can you stop the train?" Martha asked, her voice hoarse with desperate hope. "Can you bring them back?" Judge Morrison exchanged glances with the two federal officials. "We have federal marshals standing by with arrest warrants for Dr. Whitman and several associates, but we need your testimony to make the charges stick. We need you to tell your story, all of it, from the beginning." Martha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years of grief and anger settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. Telling her story meant reliving every moment of loss, every failure, every night she had wondered if her children were alive or dead. But it also meant the possibility, fragile as morning frost but real nonetheless, that this time might be different. This time, love might be enough. "When do we start?" she asked. The courtroom erupted in chaos as federal marshals burst through the doors with arrest warrants bearing the seal of the United States Attorney General. Dr. Whitman's face went ashen as the charges were read aloud: conspiracy to defraud the federal government, accepting bribes for the unlawful seizure of children, and operating a criminal enterprise under the guise of public service. The man who had sat so smugly just moments before now stood trembling as the full weight of federal justice crashed down upon him. "Dr. Augustus Whitman," the lead marshal announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the packed courtroom, "you are under arrest for violations of federal law including fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, though anything you say may be used against you in a court of law." Judge Morrison, who had been presiding over what was supposed to be a simple custody hearing, stared in amazement as the morning's events took a turn no one could have predicted. Attorney Blackhorse stepped forward with a briefcase full of evidence that would later prove to be the most damning collection of documents ever assembled against the corrupt practices of the Indian Education Initiative. "Your Honor," Blackhorse announced, his voice ringing with the authority of federal backing, "we have evidence that Dr. Whitman has been systematically targeting families across 3 territories, seizing children not for their welfare, but for financial gain. The Standing Bear children were never in danger. They were simply the latest victims in a criminal conspiracy that has destroyed hundreds of families." Martha felt her legs give way as the full magnitude of the revelation washed over her. Joseph reached out to steady her, his own face pale with shock and growing hope. Around them, the community members who had witnessed their arrests just days before murmured in amazement and shame, beginning to understand how completely they had been manipulated. But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. As Dr. Whitman was led away in shackles, Attorney Blackhorse pulled out a thick folder of documents that would change everything Martha thought she knew about her own history. "Mrs. Crowfeather," he said gently, approaching her with the careful movements of someone bearing news too large for immediate comprehension. "In the course of our investigation, we discovered records that we believe pertain to your own children, the 3 babies taken from you 30 years ago." Martha's hand flew to her throat, her breath coming in short gasps as the courtroom seemed to tilt around her. "What kind of records?" "Placement records, school enrollment documents, and—" He paused, his voice softening with compassion. "Death certificates. 2 of your children died within their first year at the Riverside Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Disease, malnutrition, the same conditions that killed hundreds of other children in the system." The words hit Martha like physical blows, each syllable confirming her worst fears while simultaneously providing the closure she had never dared to hope for. And the third, your eldest daughter, taken when she was 3 years old, survived the school system. Her name was changed to Margaret Henderson, and she was adopted by a family in Philadelphia. She's alive, Mrs. Crowfeather. She's alive, and she's been looking for you. The courtroom disappeared around Martha as the impossible became real. Somewhere in Philadelphia, the baby she had carried in her arms 30 years ago was now a grown woman with children of her own. The grief she had carried for 3 decades suddenly transformed into something else. Not joy, exactly, but a complex mixture of relief, sorrow, and tentative hope. But even as this personal miracle unfolded, the immediate crisis remained. The Standing Bear children were still being held in the federal facility, traumatized and terrified, waiting for adults to decide their fate. Swift Arrow, in particular, had stopped eating entirely, his 7-year-old mind unable to process why the woman he called Mama had been taken away again. Judge Morrison, clearly overwhelmed by the morning's revelations, called for an immediate recess while the federal authorities sorted through the evidence. But Attorney Blackhorse had one more surprise that would reshape the entire legal landscape. "Your Honor," he announced before the court could adjourn, "we have also discovered evidence that calls into question the legal basis for the territorial government's authority over these children. The Standing Bear Ranch is located on land that was never formally ceded to the United States under any treaty. According to our legal analysis, the territorial court lacks jurisdiction over this family entirely." The implications were staggering. If the land had never been legally transferred from tribal authority, then Dr. Whitman's entire case collapsed like a house built on sand. The federal government had been operating under the assumption of legal authority that had never actually existed. Judge Morrison's hands shook as he reviewed the territorial surveys and treaty documents that Blackhorse presented. As a man who had spent his career navigating the complex intersection of federal, territorial, and tribal law, he understood immediately what this meant. "If these documents are authentic," he said slowly, "then this court has been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of jurisdictional authority. The Standing Bear family may well be beyond the reach of territorial law entirely." The reversal was so complete, so unexpected, that even Martha struggled to process its implications. The morning had begun with her family facing destruction and separation. Now, within the span of a few hours, their persecutors were in chains, and their legal authority had been revealed as an illusion. But the most profound transformation was yet to come. As word of Dr. Whitman's arrest spread through the community, something remarkable began to happen. The neighbors who had stood silent during the family's arrest began arriving at the courthouse, one by one, to offer testimony about what they had actually witnessed at the Standing Bear Ranch. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, testified that she had never seen children more polite or better behaved than the Standing Bear children when they came to town. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the general store, described how Martha had taught Dancing Rain to read by using labels on canned goods, turning every shopping trip into a lesson in literacy and mathematics. Even more powerful was the testimony of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the territory's only female physician who had been quietly observing the family's situation for months. "I have examined those children multiple times," she testified, her voice clear and professional. "Their physical health, emotional development, and educational progress under Mrs. Crowfeather's care has been exemplary. Any suggestion that they were being harmed or neglected is not only false, it's absurd." As the afternoon wore on, a picture emerged of a community that had been systematically deceived by a man they had trusted as a representative of their government. The shame was palpable, but so was the determination to make amends for their complicity in an injustice. The climax came when Judge Morrison announced his ruling. Standing before a courtroom packed with community members, federal officials, and news reporters who had rushed in from surrounding territories, he delivered a verdict that would be remembered for generations. In light of the evidence presented today, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of history, I hereby dismiss all charges against Joseph Standing Bear and Martha Crowe Feather. Furthermore, I order the immediate release of the 5 Standing Bear children to their parents' custody. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. With tears streaming down his weathered face, he continued, I have spent my career believing that law and justice were the same thing. Today, I have learned that sometimes they are opposites. The law was used as a weapon against this family, but justice demands that we acknowledge our failure and do everything in our power to heal the wounds we have inflicted. As Martha stumbled from the courtroom, supported by Joseph's strong arm and surrounded by well-wishers who had suddenly discovered their voices, she caught sight of 5 small figures running toward her across the courthouse square. Swift Arrow reached her first, launching himself into her arms with such force that she nearly fell backward. "Mama, Martha!" he sobbed, his small hands tangling in her hair as if he could anchor himself to her forever. "I knew you'd come back. I knew you wouldn't leave us." One by one, the other children surrounded her. Little Wolf, with his proud facade finally cracking to reveal the frightened boy beneath, Morning Star weeping tears of relief, Dancing Rain chattering excitedly about how she had told everyone that their mama would save them, and Baby Singing Bird reaching up with chubby arms to be held. The reunion was everything Martha had dreamed of during the dark hours in her cell. But it was also something more. A vindication of the faith these children had placed in her, a confirmation that love really could triumph over the machinery of indifferent government. As she held them close, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair and feeling their heartbeats against her chest, Martha understood that this moment was worth every moment of pain that had led to it. The truth had set them free, but more than that, it had revealed that their family was stronger than any force that had tried to destroy it. The second wedding ceremony took place 3 weeks later under the same cottonwood tree, but this time the atmosphere was transformed by joy instead of shadowed by fear. The entire community had rallied around the Standing Bear family, as if their collective shame over the earlier events had crystallized into a determination to celebrate love triumphant. Martha wore the same blue dress that had been her mother's, but now it seemed to glow with a different kind of light, as if the fabric itself had been blessed by survival. Father Miguel's voice rang clear and strong as he pronounced Joseph and Martha husband and wife, the words carrying across the desert landscape like a hymn of redemption. This time, when he asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was filled not with tension, but with the peaceful contentment of a community witnessing something sacred and right. Swift Arrow stood between them during the ceremony, his small hands clasped in theirs, his face radiant with the kind of security that can only come from knowing, beyond any doubt, that he was loved and wanted. The reception that followed was a remarkable blend of cultures and traditions, with Cherokee songs mixing with Lakota dances and Spanish guitar music provided by the Rodriguez family. Mrs. Patterson had baked a towering cake decorated with wild desert flowers, while Dr. Mitchell contributed bottles of her finest elderberry wine. Even Judge Morrison attended, his presence serving as both celebration and implicit apology for the legal system that had nearly destroyed this family. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Little Wolf, now 17 and carrying himself with the dignity of a young man who had faced down federal marshals, stood to address the gathered crowd. His voice carried the strength of his Lakota heritage and the wisdom earned through recent trials. "A month ago, "I thought love was weakness," he said, his eyes finding Martha's across the crowd. "I thought caring too much made you vulnerable, made you easy to hurt. But I learned something during those days when we thought we'd lost our family forever. Love isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the universe, and the people who try to destroy it are the ones who are truly weak." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Martha barely heard it. She was too busy memorizing this moment, the sound of Little Wolf's voice strong with conviction, Morning Star's laughter as she danced with Dancing Rain, Baby Singing Bird clapping her hands in delight as Swift Arrow spun her in circles. These were the images she would carry in her heart forever, proof that sometimes fairy tales do come true for those who refuse to stop believing in them. As the celebration continued into the evening, Martha found herself in conversation with Attorney Blackhorse, who had stayed to ensure that all legal matters were properly resolved. He carried news that would add another layer of healing to an already miraculous day. "I've been in correspondence with your daughter in Philadelphia," he told her quietly, away from the celebration's noise. "Margaret. She kept the name they gave her, but she's never forgotten her Cherokee heritage. She has 2 children of her own, and she's been researching tribal genealogy for years, hoping to find her way back to her family." Martha's hand trembled as she accepted the letter he offered. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words leaped off the page with emotional intensity that transcended the decades of separation. "Dear Mother," the letter began, "I have dreamed of writing these words my entire life. I remember your face, your voice singing Cherokee lullabies, the way you smelled like sage and wildflowers. They tried to make me forget, but a mother's love leaves marks too deep to erase." Reading her lost daughter's words while surrounded by the children she had gained felt like witnessing the completion of a circle that had been broken for 30 years. The pain of loss would never completely disappear, but it was being transformed into something else. Gratitude for survival, appreciation for the family she had found, and hope for reunions yet to come. Joseph appeared at her elbow, his weathered face soft with concern as he noticed her tears. "Good news or bad?" he asked gently. "The best," Martha whispered, showing him the letter. "Margaret wants to bring her children to visit. She wants them to know their Cherokee grandmother and their new Lakota uncles and aunts." The smile that spread across Joseph's face was like sunrise breaking over the canyon walls. "Then we'd better start preparing. This house is about to get a lot more crowded." As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, the family gathered on the front porch to watch the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Baby Singing Bird had fallen asleep in Martha's lap, her thumb in her mouth and her other hand clutching a wildflower from the wedding bouquet. Swift Arrow leaned against Joseph's side, finally secure enough to show affection to both his parents without fear. The older children sprawled on the porch boards, their voices soft as they planned for the future. "Do you think Margaret's children will like us?" Dancing Rain asked, ever the worrier despite her brave exterior. "They'll love you," Martha said with absolute certainty. "Family recognizes family, no matter how long you've been apart." Morning Star looked up from the sketch she was making of the wedding scene, her artistic eye capturing details that cameras couldn't preserve. "Will you teach them Cherokee songs, Mama Martha? The ones your grandmother taught you?" "I'll teach them everything I can remember," Martha promised. "And you can teach them Lakota traditions, and your papa can show them how to read the desert like a book. We'll make sure they know where they come from and who they are." Little Wolf, who had been quietly contemplating the vast star field above them, spoke with the thoughtfulness that had become his trademark. "I used to think our family was broken because we weren't all the same blood, but maybe that's what makes us stronger. We're like a river made from many streams. Each one brings something different, but together they're more powerful than anyone could be alone. As the night deepened and the children eventually drifted off to bed, Martha and Joseph remained on the porch, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist. The contentment between them was profound and peaceful, the satisfaction of people who had fought for their happiness and won. "Do you think we'll have more challenges?" Martha asked, voicing the question that lingered despite their victory. "Probably," Joseph answered honestly. "Life doesn't stop throwing curves just because you've had one happy ending. But we'll face whatever comes together as a family. And we'll remember that love is always stronger than fear, always stronger than hate, always stronger than the people who try to tell us we don't deserve happiness." Martha closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes calling in the distance, the gentle rustle of wind through sage, the soft breathing of 5 children sleeping peacefully in their beds. These were the sounds of home, of safety, of a future full of possibilities. In the months that followed, their house would indeed become more crowded as Margaret and her children made their first visit, then decided to relocate permanently to be near their newfound family. The ranch would expand, the community would continue to heal, and the Standing Bear name would become synonymous with the power of chosen family and unconditional love. But on this perfect night, under a blanket of desert stars, Martha simply held close the miracle of the present moment. She had spent 30 years believing that her story was one of loss and tragedy. Now she understood that it had always been a love story. It had just taken a while for all the characters to find their way to the same page. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, addressing the Great Spirit, the universe, and the mysterious forces that had guided her to this place, this family, this moment of perfect peace. The desert wind carried her words away like a prayer answered, and the stars continued their ancient dance overhead, witnesses to another family finding its way home. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings come wrapped in our deepest pain, and the family we're meant to have isn't always the one we're born into. It's the one that chooses us when we need them most. Martha Crowe. Feather's story reminds us that at 52, when the world whispered she was too old to start over, she discovered that love has no expiration date, and second chances can arrive at any season of life. Her journey from a broken widow to the beloved mother of 5 children proves that our scars don't disqualify us from happiness. They prepare us to recognize it when it finally arrives. In a world that often tells seniors their best years are behind them, Martha's story declares boldly that some of life's most beautiful chapters are written in silver ink. Her courage to love again after devastating loss, to fight for family when the system tried to tear them apart, and to believe that chosen families can be just as sacred as blood families speaks to every heart that has ever wondered if it's too late for their own miracle. Real families aren't built on DNA. They're forged in the fires of unconditional love, daily choice, and the courage to keep believing that home is wherever hearts choose to stay together. What family member, whether by blood or choice, has shown you that love has no boundaries? Have you ever experienced a too late moment that turned into a just-in-time blessing? Share your story in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.